So since we started watching a lot of AEW, I kind of wanted to talk about a lot of, I guess, what we'd consider the lore of the company, essentially, since retroactively I've been watching a lot of the stuff to just kind of catch up and have the context and a lot of like storylines and stuff with a lot of the characters that I might not be familiar with, and like, you know, a lot of the indie stars and New Japan stars that I loved who have now a couple years, 4 or 5 years essentially worth of context and new kind of experiences and character development that has happened that I haven't really been too privy to until really recently, with kind of catching up and starting to watch AEW weekly. With that being said, there's actually a specific thing I kind of want to tackle, which was the 4 pillars of AEW, and I think it's actually really interesting to analyze now. I think way kind of down the line where, the kind of concept of that is kind of lost at this point, especially when, I think at this point AEW on its own is really firm in its identity without really the help or specific or a specific entity that's kind of propping it up as a company. I don't think that the pillar of AEW conversation happens as much as the company itself seems to be stable enough and is respected enough that it can kind of exist on its own regardless of the talent that's in it due to its own ethos. But regardless, we had the OG kind of 4 pillars in Sammy Guevara. You had, I think, MJF, you had Jack Perry, and I think you had, Darby Allin were the 4, which I think, thinking about kind of where everyone is, obviously career trajectory-wise, I think, they've all gone on to do a lot of amazing stuff, obviously in different levels of the card, but I think they've all definitively stepped into their own, have created their own unique characters, and have uniquely, kind of identified or shaped the identity of AEW. But I do think there's genuinely a different 4 pillars that kind of represent, I think, genuinely why AEW is so good and who and what it is kind of for. And I kind of want to talk about who I think the true, I guess, pillars of AEW would be kind of today, kind of with the landscape we have, the trajectory of everything, and especially what has happened kind of with, obviously the 4 original pillars that exist and where they are now, and, these new pillars that I kind of think should be, deemed the true pillars, at least in my opinion. My kind of 4 list, essentially we're keeping both MJF and Darby Allin on this pillars list. I think both Darby and MJF are like bona fide stars in the fact that they've been able to essentially elicit top level and be in programs with top level stars and elicit the same reaction or even more fervor for themselves versus the people that they are with, and people that are established like Moxley, Omega, and stuff like that. And not only have they held their own but flourished, have shown the mastery in the craft, and have created a style, not necessarily created a style, but have personified their characters in such a way that you already see people kind of imitating MJF and Darby now, kind of even within AEW and within the indies. The way MJF kind of acts as a heel and how he keeps it super classic is such a it's such a throwback, but at the same time, like the way he kind of does it in this smarmy kind of using his faith and stuff like that and stuff like that just makes it so uniquely him. And I think a lot of people enjoy that and have kind of gleaned onto it as proper, like some of the best heel work of today. It's kind of cool to see both him and Darby kind of create their own like such unique paths in prominent spots on the card too. Like Darby Allin coming from the rafters to help Hangman Page win that AEW World Title, man. Like, dude, that's legit the Crow Sting moment where that you get from right there, which is super cool and is awesome due to Darby's obviously relation with Sting, for example, but those two, I think MJF and Darby obviously I think stay as 2 core pillars, especially when they're genuine draws for the program. There have been kind of dips, I think, and especially with MJF, I think there was a point in time too where a lot of like maybe the internet fan base was kind of souring on his shtick, but he was always extremely consistent. And I think especially in a podcast he's talked about it, where his consistency isn't just being good, but it's being at the level he is, that excellence, and not faltering, and it's like as soon as you have those slip ups, that's what separates you from, like, that's what separates S tiers from A tiers, right? And the same thing for Darby, especially with his punishing style. It's very polarizing for a lot of people, what he kind of does, despite it being, like similar to, like, very much to me, like Mick Foley. A lot of people are super polarized by his look, how he does things, but I think uniquely that's what sets him apart, and has allowed him to create this unique Sting-like Mick Foley kind of character that's super cool and kind of trademark AEW in terms of its hardcoreness, its edginess, and being alternative, which Darby Allin kind of is, right? Him and MJF, super awesome, definitely pillars. And the two people that I would essentially add onto this list are kind of also intertwined with each other, but it would be Hangman and Swerve. Obviously, I pointed to when Darby Allin had the whole rafter situation where he came and assisted Hangman on his second title win. Hangman Adam Page, was part of that initial elite group, right? The Bullet Club, which was, you had Kenny, the Bucks, you had Cody at the time, you had Cole. What was important about that at the time is that Adam Page was, while he had the opportunity to go to like NXT or to go through that WWE system, similar to like how Adam Cole went and, had a really fun career that eventually came back, Adam could have easily been, or Hangman could have easily been a real top WWE star, but he took a chance with the dudes he was with out in New Japan and ROH, and really grew into, the Hangman we know now, through like this whole journey in AEW. Like, we really look back at that first title reign, which I've mentioned before, and it was kind of underwhelming. He had a lot of fanfare going in, and he was building up, that cowboy shit persona. But even at the time, at that first reign, it wasn't as established as heavy. He was still a decent promo. He had a lot of fire, and he was always amazing in the ring. But it wasn't really until he started to kind of go off the deep end, kind of start doing more heelish things, and then really that feud that him and Swerve had, to me, which is why I also put Swerve on this list as well. But him and Swerve really, to me, especially with their death matches, and their trilogy of essentially of those crazy matches, have redefined to me like the definition of a grudge match. With how they took it and the way they told the story of like wanting to destroy each other, and how that like manifests essentially in these two characters when they wrestle each other. That for both Swerve and Hangman, they found both their strides in destroying each other, which I think is just super beautiful, and it's such a storyline you would never, I think, ever get in WWE, just because like I think you would get certain aspects of it, the house burning, the certain soap opera elements, but I don't think you would get the pure brutality that these two are kind of able to always exude in their matches, and the legit danger you feel for both of them when they're wrestling. AEW uniquely, to a lot of people's dismay, which I've realized on the internet, feels dangerous. When things feel dangerous, it's genuinely intense and interesting. And I think a lot of people for wrestling don't want that detachment sometimes, because then maybe they don't feel like it's wrestling anymore. I don't know. Back to both what Swerve and Hangman did there with their feud, I think it felt legitimately dangerous. And then that kind of trend kind of led for both of them kind of moving forward into other feuds. Essentially, both of them eventually catching their AEW titles respectively, through really fun chases that had the whole crowd rooting for them, as essentially AEW like originals. I know initially Swerve was in NXT, you know what I mean, but essentially he became, the Swerve we know through the trials and tribulations of a lot of the feud he had in AEW. The match between him and Bryan Danielson at All in Wembley, where Daniel Bryan wins the title. So I actually don't even agree with that initial win. I know a lot of AEW fans love that. It's like a peak moment. But, I do think that Swerve should have actually won there, and the whole kind of turn should have happened anyway because of Bryan losing. But, because he wasn't strong enough. But that's just me, and that could be a whole nother video. But I do love that Swerve can be that ultimate villain or that ultimate face. You know what I mean? And with him when Prince Nana, both theme songs are immediately iconic. You know what I mean? So it's just he's the full package. And when I think of AEW, he's one of the people I think about because without him taking a bet on himself and leaving NXT, you don't have this Swerve character, because a lot of the wanting to prove himself, the danger in Swerve is wanting to prove it because he had nothing to lose. If you look at the essence of the story, where the home that he bought because he eventually made it in AEW was burned down by Hangman, that brought out that character in Swerve, that ruthlessness that got him the victory over Kenny Omega a couple weeks back, right before Revolution. Kenny did win the rebound match, which was amazing, by the way, on this past Dynamite. God, amazing match. A lot of amazing matches. It's been so refreshing watching AEW, but regardless, it's just, I love seeing, like, especially in the bell-to-bell stuff, the growth and change of these characters with Hangman Page, with Swerve, and I feel like, and with Darby and with MJF through the title reigns, like Darby's TNT title reign that he had, that was so fun watching him have these bangers in the middle of the card with so many people. I can go on and on about these guys, but I think comparatively, right, Hangman, Swerve, MJF and Darby, compared to the Sammy, Jack Perry, MJF and Darby, is obviously Jack Perry. I think especially with the brawl out stuff, a lot of people have soured on him, but I think he's always done really good work. He's always had a great look, a super unique look, and like I said, he is another unique story of AEW. You don't have someone like that reach the heights they do in WWE. He was given a chance in AEW with that whole team, and he really ran with it. And then when he went with the heel storyline, when they turned that whole brawl out thing into something, he ran with it extremely well. When he had that TNT belt, bloodied it up and was running around, I thought that was really interesting. I'm surprised that they kind of cut it short, I think because more people were reminded of CM Punk rather than focusing on the storyline, which does make sense since you did try to rewire that as Heat. But I do think that there is there's an argument to be made for Jack Perry being still a pillar. Sammy Guevara, on the other hand, I do think he's extremely talented. He's done a lot of good work. I think he's someone who would actually benefit more going to WWE with his style, how he looks, kind of him and Tay, I think would actually benefit now more than ever if they went to WWE with the vlogs they do, kind of how they travel and do their stuff. I do think, obviously they cultivated a family and built stuff in AEW, and they both had really fun moments over there, obviously, but I do think that the other gentlemen I've mentioned have kind of had more of an impact, I think, in AEW and on the growth of it just overall. I think Sammy, like I said, Sammy Guevara he's an amazing talent, and I remember, he was one of the, I think I actually remember seeing him on either What Culture Pro Wrestling or one of those indies where he was, he came in to stop Walter, at the time, and got like his soul chopped out of his chest, you know what I mean? But he had an amazing sell, and you know what I mean? And that's what kind of stuck out for me. But he's another talented dude, so I don't want to disparage, obviously, either Jack Perry or Sammy Guevara. I think they are like, if pillars, if there were more than 4 pillars that I can put on this building, I think they would be like 5 and 6. They definitely are the essence of AEW, like defined. I just think that the other people that we've mentioned have kind of had a more, have had a grander effect. You know what I mean? I think Swerve and Hangman do deserve kind of that nomenclature, and are essentially like the heart and soul of AEW. I think a lot of people, especially in the fans like discussions and stuff like that, they'll point to wanting Hangman or Swerve to kind of being the foil to any major heel champion that's happening, and that always points to who we kind of dictate as the main baby faces or main beloved characters in AEW, because you want to see them win the title, you want to see them take that chase because it's interesting, it's captivating, you know, especially with AEW being such a young company. We get to have these fun conversations about the formative years of the company and who kind of led that, you know. And I think, you know, MJF feuding with Adam Page and all these guys kind of hovering around the title, you know, the four that I mentioned, I think is extremely important for the health of AEW, as these are the people who have defined its come up and have defined the uniqueness, the alternative brand, the types of matches that you can have here, the brutality that can exist, the depth and storytelling that can happen in the ring to ring and in the bell to bell, you know, in the squared circle is you know, in part thanks to the creativity of these gentlemen, working obviously with the people who you know work on AEW, but you know, the talent here really does define and feel like what AEW is all about. That's kind of my opinion on my four pillars. I got Swerve, Hangman, Darby, and MJF. You know, you have MJF, the GOAT heel. You have Darby Allin, kind of the anti-establishment Mick Foley kind of presence. You know, I think he kind of represents the kindred spirits, right, in AEW, and I think he's such a perfect character for that. And then you kind of have, like I said, Swerve, who is just one of the most dangerous men in AEW, and such a come-up story about being rejected by the system and then proving that you are $1 million and just carrying that energy with you no matter what. You know what I mean? That's what I kind of love about Swerve's character. And I think Prince Nana being kind of his being there just accentuates that, if that makes sense. Hangman just coming into his own, becoming a murderous goddamn monster, you know, even with his menacing stare now, comparatively to him at the press conference, or even him you know, going bar for CM Punk during his first title reign. You know, you just see such a swagger and intensity and movie-like presence now to Hangman too. It's just awesome to see, you know what I mean? And I think it really is a testament to AEW giving these guys the platform to show out and try and really do these things and have these grand stories, you know. That's kind of what I think about the new four pillars and what I kind of think are the new four pillars. So I don't know if you guys have like maybe different names you guys want to mention. You know, I know a lot of people like Daniel Garcia, the Acclaimed are such a, you know, a big AEW act. I mean, I just think that, you know, the new four pillars would definitely be those four, you know, and like I said, no disparaging to Jack Perry or Sammy, you know what I mean, but I just think that the four guys I mentioned are just operating on such a high level, you know, that it's just hard to even like to keep up with that, you know what I mean? And they genuinely represent and love AEW, and that's probably the best thing too about it, is that these aren't guys that feel necessarily like company men, but they feel like people extremely grateful and understand the positions that they're in. Just in general, those are my four pillars, the four true pillars of AEW. Let me know if you guys have, you know, different four. Put them down in the comments what your four pillars of AEW are, and if I should do this maybe for like WWE, you know, as well, to see, you know, because like, you know, I guess it would be for eras and stuff like that, since WWE is a lot older, but you know, it's an interesting conversation with AEW, since like I said, it's such a young company, so we can kind of really trace and quantify and look at really who had the most influence, you know, and what was happening, you know. So let me know what you guys think. I've been loving to cover AEW. It's gotten my kind of juices flowing. I've been wanting to chat about wrestling a lot more. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video.